Hello, my name is Brian Gettler, and today I will be speaking about some research that I was fortunate enough to do as a fellow, a 6-month fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute between January and June of 2025. This work is taken from a much larger project on the origins and the early history of what is called the Indian Fund. And so today I'll be talking about, in fact, the prehistory of the Indian Fund, the way in which the fund is imagined, and in fact, how initially a number of people who are unaffiliated really with the state in what is today Ontario, at the time was called Upper Canada, how they imagined dispossession of Indigenous peoples could pay for itself and, in fact, could secure the future of the colony in um, in the absence of significant funds. So this is the Indian Fund. Basically, is as I just said, is the idea here is that it's a way of making dispossession pay for itself. What the basic idea is that Indigenous peoples, uh, First Nations, had been signing treaties with the British Crown since the 18th century, and in the early 19th century, when the state is uh, is facing kind of financial shortfalls, the idea is that this the land that is being surrendered to the crown through treaties could be sold, and the proceeds could be invested to form a capital fund, and the interest on that capital fund could be used for a variety of things. These are basically social engineering projects, things like schooling, farming, European style housing, to teach language and so forth, but also to fund the basic infrastructure of the state. So initially, this includes things like the Indian Department. So this is the organization, the state institution that is responsible for relations with Indigenous peoples. Um, but also later on, in from the mid to late 19th century, more kind of classic forms of infrastructure like roads and so forth. This a crucial point with this idea of the Indian Fund, once it comes into existence, is that it is under the state's control, so not under First Nations control. So First Nations can request that the funds be used for certain purposes, but those the ultimate sort of say lies with the state and with government officials. Uh, the Indian Fund exists, is created, and we'll get to this in the sort of second third of the 19th century, but it still exists today. And so here is we see a graph from the recent Yellowhead Institute report in 2021 that came out called Cashback that looks at the ways in which the state remains the trustee for large, in fact, colossal sums of money that, in theory, belong to First Nations across Canada. This is not a new phenomenon, though, and this is, as I said, created in the 19th century, and so my project really is looking at its origins. From the 1830s on, so this is kind of the moment when the Indian Fund is created, until the 1860s, although this, in fact, this continues later, it's less transparent how it works. The Indian Fund is used by officials to invest in a whole series of colonial infrastructure projects. So one of the first of these, for example, in 1834, is to pave roads and sidewalks in downtown of what is the newly incorporated city of Toronto. It's also used for a number of harbor and canal companies invested in local governments, so municipal governments, but also things like the Law Society of Upper Canada. So this is, basically the courts, and McGill University. is basically is bailed out in 1860 by the Indian Fund. But what I want to do today is I want to kind of back us up. So rather than talk about the Indian Fund proper, I want to talk about the ideas that fuel the creation of the Indian Fund. It starts with a kind of shift in Indigenous policy on the part of the British in what is now Ontario in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, especially the late 1810s, towards annuities. So this is, simply put, annual payments in exchange for land that is being covered by treaties. The first of these is commonly called Treaty Number 18 and is signed in 1818. But prior to this point, the way that treaties in Upper Canada worked was that the signatory nations, the First Nations, did not receive annual payments. Instead, what they did was they would receive one-time lump sum payments in goods. So this is not happening in money. And in fact, in annuities, it doesn't happen in cash immediately either. But those goods are being paid for by the British Empire, by London, not by the colony itself. And so the move to annuities in 1818 is influenced by a desire to make dispossession pay for itself. So in 1818, the idea is that the general territorial revenues of the colony of Upper Canada uh, will will fund annuities. So lands that are covered by treaty will be sold to settlers. The annual payments or the payments that are required from time to time for these lands by settlers will be paid into the Crown, the Commissioner of Crown Land, and that money will, at least a part of it, will go to purchase goods that would be given out to the signatory nations every year. Now, this is appealing to the British Treasury because it basically makes dispossession, as I've said already, kind of pay for itself. It looks like it's going to take some of the burden off of the British Treasury. But it's appealing, and I think that this is an important point. It's appealing as well to chiefs, to First Nations chiefs, and in fact, this is a selling point. The Indian Department uses this in its negotiations, but that rather than the old style of giving out a large quantity of goods every now and then, or when a treaty is signed, the new version would give arms and ammunition, blankets, and so forth, the same sorts of goods, but do it every year. And so as these goods wear out, uh, the First Nations signatories would receive replacement goods, and this was for responsible political leaders, the chiefs of First Nations. This made a lot of sense, right? This meant that they would be getting access to the sorts of materials that they wanted, but every year rather than only once. Now, I would just say quickly, this is not a new idea. There are lots of precedent for this, but most importantly, for our case, is what's happening in the US. And so we have things like as early as 1794, under the Treaty of Canandaigua, you have in New York, you have the creation of annuities. And so there is a kind of, a recognition or an understanding that this is already happening in the US, and this gets adopted into British policy in the 1810s. Now, the Indian Fund is a little bit different than this because the Indian Fund isn't just about handing over every year annuities. It's about, in fact, creating a specific capital fund based on Indigenous land sales, leases, and the sale and lease of natural resources on those lands. And so we first see this really happening at about the same time, shortly after annuities. Here's a case from a treaty council that leads up to what gets known as Treaty 22 in 1820. And in this, the Indian Department is promising that, quote, the whole of the proceeds of this surrender shall be applied towards educating your children and instructing yourselves in the principles of the Christian religion. and that a certain portion of the said tract so surrendered will be set apart for your accommodations and that of your families, on which huts will be erected as soon as possible. So all of this would be funded by land sales. So there's this kind of project that's being enunciated for the first time at this moment. And so this is Treaty 22. So this is just west of present day Toronto. So we're talking about the southern parts of the cities of Mississauga and Oakville. And these lands, so there's a nominal payment for the acreage that is surrendered by the Mississaugas in 1820. But the main promise here is not annuities, it's not lump sum payments, it's something entirely new, which is a fund that will allow for Indigenous peoples uh, to continue to live in the village or to have the village created and to have education paid for and so forth. So why is this happening? Why are annuities and why is the Indian Fund emerging in the late 1810s? The most proximate response to that is war, in fact. So the British Empire in the War of 1812 in North America and the Napoleonic Wars more broadly goes massively into debt, as a result of these wide-ranging military engagements. And one of the major expenses or an important expense in North America in the War of 1812 is presents for Indigenous allies. So this basically is goods, like I've said, blankets, arms, ammunition, and so forth, that are given to the Crown's Indigenous allies at various points throughout the war as part of, the British attempt to maintain these alliances during wartime. And once the war ends, the Indian Department is ordered to retrench. So it's ordered to cut back massively. And there's a kind of an understanding on the part of administrators that Upper Canada, in particular, is incredibly cash strapped at this point, uh, but it is land rich. So it has land that, if this could be turned into a commodity, if this could be brought to market, could be used to generate funds in order to run the kind of various apparatuses of government. And so, insofar as historians have paid attention to this, we've tended to credit Peregrine Maitland, Sir Peregrine Maitland, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada from 1818 to 1828. Now, what I'm going to talk about today in my remaining time is how Maitland ends up getting the idea to do this. So I don't want to say that Maitland isn't important in this process. In fact, he is. But I think historians' accounts have tended to focus almost solely on him, whereas in fact he's getting his ideas from several different places. One of these is this man, John Norton, who's a British soldier and who comes over in the late 18th century to North America and becomes Joseph Brant's protege. So Joseph Brant, an important Haudenosaunee leader from their lands, the Haudenosaunee lands in what is now upstate New York, and then later on at the Grand River in southwestern Ontario. Um, so Maitland does a bunch of work in the late 1810s and early 1820s, and so it makes sense that historians are paying attention to him. He's an important man, but also he's drafting detailed plans on how to set up basically the Indian Fund, how to make dispossession pay for itself. And how to make dispossession pay for other things too. So he's planting also this sort of the seed that will sprout into this idea that colonial infrastructure can be paid for through dispossession. For example, he proposes a military hospital at around the same time. But Norton proposes a number of new systems that are kind of along these lines first. So in 1808, so 10 years before Maitland turns up in the colony, Norton proposes basically a developmental loan scheme. So the idea here is that individual members of First Nations could borrow funds that would be generated from their land sales, much like the Indian Fund would be, and that they could do so against their own personal property. So this is a kind of project that would have encouraged individual property ownership on the part of indigenous peoples, and would have made the capital generated by the sale of their lands available to the community, to community members for various kind of building projects, infrastructural building projects, and so forth. In 1816, he turns, so now in 1808, he's still at Grand River. He basically gets chased out and, in fact, threatened with death if he returns. Um, for a number of reasons that aren't really relevant to the current conversation. But in 1816, he turns up further west in what is now southwestern Ontario, and he's arguing in favor of using land sales to support a different kind of institution. So schools, basically, boarding schools. And the idea here again being that Indigenous peoples, rather than developmental loans, that Indigenous peoples could use the education that they would get in these institutions to improve themselves. So these are both kind of improvement sorts of projects. Now, the Colonial Office in London is quite receptive to these projects. Notably, the Colonial Secretary, Lord Bathurst, who in fact meets with Norton, is seems interested. And as an aside, Bathurst is also Maitland's mentor, and so it's entirely possible that prior to Maitland going to Upper Canada, Bathurst would have spoken to him about these projects. But Norton found himself opposed by two very powerful men who very much did not like him. So that is William Clouse, who is the superintendent of Indian Affairs in Upper Canada, and Sir Francis Gore, who is Maitland's predecessor as Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And since these two men oppose Norton personally, his schemes go nowhere. Now, I think it's important to point out that there is, what I am talking about is the state controlling funds, but there are a number of instances in both Upper and Lower Canada. So Lower Canada is, now the southern part of what is now the province of Quebec, where Indigenous nations manage to set aside funds and, in fact, manage them on their own without government oversight. So, the Abenaki of Odanak, for example, have what they call the Pitagnan in the late 18th century up through the 1840s. Ganawage also has community funds that, in fact, through a contract, a loan contract with the Catholic Church in Montreal, they managed to maintain payments or incoming funds on their monies almost to the end of the 19th century, something that the Indian Department is very much not keen on. The Wendat, so here is a picture of François Xavier Picard, Taurenche, who is a chief in Wendake outside of Quebec City. They also have a fund that basically they use the timber on one of their reserves to create a fund that they can then use for all sorts of community building purposes. These are somewhat different from what we see in Upper Canada, and that is because these monies have to do with basically the seigneurial regime, seigneurial rents, which is not a system that exists in Upper Canada at this point. There is another sort of exception to this, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, the Six Nations of the Grand, in what is now Ontario. But these funds are very much targeted by the Indian Department from the 1830s, really from the moment that the Indian Fund comes online. These are seen as problematic, and this has a lot to do with basically the stereotypes that are becoming increasingly common of Indigenous peoples as being improvident, as being unable to control their own monies. So the other key person prior to Maitland along with Norton, in thinking through the kind of idea of the Indian Fund is this man, is Malcolm MacGregor. So we know very little about him. He was the former paymaster of the North Devonshire Regiment in the Napoleonic Wars, and he later on goes on to become the British consul in Panama. But he really inspired, I mean, he proposes a system that is really quite similar to what becomes the Indian Fund. So he's supported by Lieutenant Governor Francis Gore of Upper Canada. And in fact, what seems to have happened is that MacGregor comes to Upper Canada in 1817 or 1816 and meets, the appropriate colonial administrators. And they, because he has a project in mind of setting up a kind of a colony that would bring people over from Britain, uh, former soldiers who would, farm the land and create agricultural infrastructure that would then uh, help kind of enrich the land. And his proposal, so he goes to visit the Credit River, it was now southern Mississauga, um, just west of Toronto, and he then petitions for lands along the river, saying that he would, quote, pay an adequate annual compensation for the benefit of the Indians. And what we see here is a kind of this sort of paternalism that becomes very important in a decade or two in the Indian department, uh, but also this idea of paying annual compensation, so much like annuities, though this is before annuities, in order to implant a colony. He wants to do this along the Credit River. So the Credit River, pictured here, is one of the major salmon streams in on the north shore of Lake Ontario. It's been fished by the Mississaugas from time immemorial. But basically, what MacGregor proposes is, in addition to paying the Mississaugas for the lands each year, he would and his colony would build a number of mills. So this would develop the colony, as it were, but also he would protect the Mississaugas from the kind of negative influence of people coming in and targeting the fishery. Um, Basically, they would, as he wrote, lend, quote, every effort in his power to prevent the fishery being encroached upon by improper and unauthorized persons. And he says, particularly from persons from the United States. Now, this is pointing back in time, since by this point, for over 2 decades, the Mississaugas have been having quite a bit of problems with both people coming up from the U.S., but also just settlers in what is today Southern Ontario, who were, poaching fish and also immediately targeting, in fact, the fisheries. And here we have 1797. The government of Upper Canada uh, promulgates a proclamation that says that that the government would pursue anybody found guilty of damaging the fishery and burial places of the Mississaugas. But that this proclamation remains kind of a dead letter. It's never in fact enforced in any meaningful way. And so here you have MacGregor turning up 20 years later, who's proposing a private or a privatized solution. He's saying, "Let me rent the lands, and I will make sure that the fisheries are safe." Um, MacGregor revises his plan, seemingly directed by the lieutenant governor, to respect kind of general colonial practice. So rather than renting the lands directly, the MacGregor would first need to arrange for the Mississaugas to cede their lands on the credit to the crown, who would then lease the lands to MacGregor. Um, The colonists would set up farms, and especially their mills would be a commercial success, and that would allow for annual payments to the Mississaugas, and these funds would help the Mississaugas prosper. In fact, in this space, the Mississaugas end up profiting or prospering, excuse me, materially. We see here an image drawn much later of what the Credit River Mission would have looked like. But the Credit River Mission does not get its start under MacGregor. In fact, MacGregor petitions a number of times and is never, in fact, satisfied. And in early 1819, he's, he's a bit desperate, and he says, would you just, he asks the Colonial Office to just send the entire correspondence with him to the new Lieutenant Governor, um, so that he can review the project. And Maitland sends this to Klaus in the Indian Department, who ends up advising against the scheme. It seems, however, though, that this scheme is central to Maitland rethinking his whole approach, or coming up with this approach based on Indigenous dispossession as a way of getting around the cash-strapped finances of Upper Canada. And so we see within weeks only negotiations beginning. So here's a piece from June 1819 draft agreement that precedes Treaty 22 in 1820. So we see kind of immediately after Maitland receives this, there are members of the Indian Department who go out, who meet the Mississaugas, who are already proposing a scheme very similar to what MacGregor had been proposing himself. Now, historians tend to emphasize here the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and this isn't unreasonable. This is most likely why Gore, in fact, kind of revises or helps MacGregor revise his proposal, saying, no, we can't actually allow you to rent the lands. The Crown has to purchase them first. But MacGregor has very little kind of awareness of this. What he's trying to do is to set himself up and his family up. And in fact, he says this very clearly in his petitions. He says, I have a wife and young children, and I'm looking to make my way in the world. Now, MacGregor, his project isn't entirely novel in that there are other examples, and there's one important example of a kind of older system that wasn't quite as centralized as what MacGregor was proposing, but that involved annual payments from settlers for Indigenous lands. And this is the Six Nations Trust. So the Six Nations, the Grand River in southwestern Ontario. But by the time MacGregor is making his pitch in 1817, uh, officials already see this earlier trust, the Six Nations Trust, as somewhat problematic. It's been around for 20 years by this point, but they're noticing. In fact, the issues are several, but one of them is that the trustees involved in this, though they are all, in fact, are all office holders in the colonial state, don't have much. They're named in their person, so privately, and they don't have much ability to force payment on the part of those people who settlers who have taken up lands. So there's limited payment happening. The other issue is that this is only partially controlled by the state, and in fact, Maitland is initially plays around with the idea of setting up a trust, but comes down kind of on the side of, in fact, it would be better if the state were more centrally involved. Uh, that said, this project here that MacGregor proposes, and indeed that the Six Nations already had, is in some sense seen as positive by policymakers both in Britain and Canada because it's meeting the kind of humanitarian discourse of the empire. So making, treating Indigenous peoples well, but also it's working in service, and MacGregor's project very clearly would work in service of austerity, which, frankly, throughout the period is kind of the motivating principle of British activity with respect to Indigenous peoples in Canada. So just to kind of bring this story to a close, um, what ends up happening is Maitland in his projects that he writes up, he targets both the Six Nations and the Mississaugas. The Six Nations want nothing to do with this because this, in fact, would involve more land cessions, and they do not want to give up any more of their land at this point. The Mississaugas, though, seem quite interested. And so they accept. The British Treasury very much embraces this scheme that Maitland has put together, and because it seems to them to get it out of paying for much of the kind of developmental work that by the late 1810s and early 1820s, humanitarians in Britain and colonial officials are starting to think may be necessary with respect to First Nations. Now, this is inscribed in Treaty 22 in 1820, but despite this fact, there's really no evidence of immediate collection of funds. So we have this treaty that proclaims that this is going to happen, but so far as we can tell, in fact, it doesn't happen. And this has everything to do with the land market in Upper Canada. In fact, from the very late 1810s through most of the 1820s, the land market in Upper Canada is absolutely in the doldrums. It's the Maitland made very optimistic projections about the sale of lands, about how much money that would bring in, and about the ability of settlers to pay that money. That all, in fact, were wildly optimistic. Land, there was a glut of land, and prices were very, very low. And so the system very quickly, it became evident, would not work. It couldn't sustain itself. That said, it very much provides the blueprint for what emerges as the Indian Fund itself in the mid 1830s, and also, especially through the Crown's involvement later in the 1820s with the Mississaugas of the Credit, it provides the blueprint for a civilization, what so-called civilization policy that gets adopted from the end of the 1830s, at least, or 1820s, excuse me, at least officially. And so at the higher levels of colonial administration, there's a turn towards this idea of remaking Indigenous peoples as, and bringing them up. There's this sort of language that gets used up to the level of settlers. And this happens under the watch and very much under the influence of Maitland's successor, Sir John Colborne, who takes over the position in 1828. Um, and as well, so Colborne then is the one who actually creates the Indian Fund, but really, I would say Maitland, based on influences coming from Indigenous peoples themselves, but also John Norton and Malcolm McGregor is the architect. Thank you.